The Mysterious Lodger, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, Part 1. About the year 1822 I resided in a comfortable and roomy old house, the exact locality of which I need not particularize, further than to say that it was not very far from Old Brompton, in the immediate neighborhood, or rather continuity, as even my Camara readers perfectly well know, of the renowned city of London. Though this house was roomy and comfortable, as I have said, it was not, by any means, a handsome one. It was composed of dark red brick, with small windows, and thick white sashes, a porch, none of your flimsy trellis work, but a solid projection of the same vermilion masonry surmounted by a leaded balcony, with heavy, half-rotten balustrades, darkened the hall door with a perennial gloom. The mansion itself stood in a walled enclosure, which had, perhaps, from the date of the erection itself, been devoted to shrubs and flowers. Some of the former had grown there almost to the dignity of trees, and two dark little yews stood at each side of the porch, like swart and inauspicious dwarfs, guarding the entrance of an enchanted castle. Not that my domicile in any respect deserved the comparison. It had no reputation as a haunted house. If it ever had any ghosts, nobody remembered them. Its history was not known to me. It may have witnessed plots, cabals, and forgeries, bloody suicides and cruel murders. It was certainly old enough to have become acquainted with iniquity. A small stone slab, under the balustrade, and over the arch of the porch I mentioned, had the date 1672, and a half-effaced coat of arms, which I might have deciphered any day, had I taken the trouble to get a ladder, but always put it off. All I can say for the house is, that it was well stricken in years, with a certain air of sombre comfort about it, contained a vast number of rooms and closets, and, what was of far greater importance, was got by me a dead bargain. Its individuality attracted me. I grew fond of it for itself, and for its associations, until other associations of a hateful kind first disturbed, and then destroyed, their charm. I forgave its dull red brick, and pinched white windows, for the sake of the beloved and cheerful faces within. Its ugliness was softened by its age, and its sombre evergreens, and moss-grown stone flower pots, were relieved by the brilliant hues of 1,000 gay and graceful flowers that peeped among them, or nodded over the grass. Within that old house lay my life's treasure. I had a darling little girl of 9, and another little darling boy just 4 years of age, and dearer, unspeakably, than either a wife, the prettiest, gayest, best little wife in all London. When I tell you that our income was scarcely £380 a year, you will perceive that our establishment cannot have been a magnificent one, yet, I do assure you, we were more comfortable than a great many lords, and happier, I dare say, than the whole peerage put together. This happiness was not, however, what it ought to have been. The reader will understand at once, and save me a world of moralizing circumlocution, when he learns, bluntly and nakedly, that, among all my comforts and blessings, I was an infidel. I had not been without religious training. On the contrary, more than average pains had been bestowed upon my religious instruction from my earliest childhood. My father, a good, plain, country clergyman, had worked hard to make me as good as himself, and had succeeded, at least, in training me in godly habits. He died, however, when I was but 12 years of age, and fate had long before deprived me of the gentle care of a mother. A boarding school, followed by a college life, where nobody having any very direct interest in realizing in my behalf the ancient blessing, that in fullness of time I should die a good old man, I was left very much to my own devices, which, in truth, were none of the best. Among these were the study of Voltaire, Tom Paine, Hume, Shelley, and the whole school of infidels, poetical as well as prose. This pursuit, and the all but blasphemous vehemence with which I gave myself up to it, was, perhaps, partly reactionary. A somewhat injudicious austerity and precision had indissolubly associated in my childish days the ideas of restraint and gloom with religion. I bore it a grudge, and so, when I became thus early my own master, I set about paying off, after my own fashion, the old score I owed it. I was besides, like every other young infidel whom it has been my fate to meet, a conceited coxcomb. A smattering of literature, without any real knowledge, and a great assortment of all the cut and dry flippancies of the school I had embraced, constituted my intellectual stock in trade. I was, like most of my school of philosophy, very proud of being an unbeliever, and fancied myself, in the complacency of my wretched ignorance, at an immeasurable elevation above the church-going, Bible-reading herd, whom I treated with a good-humoured superciliousness which I thought vastly indulgent. My wife was an excellent little creature and truly pious. She had married me in the full confidence that my levity was merely put on, and would at once give way before the influence she hoped to exert upon my mind. Poor little thing! She deceived herself. I allowed her, indeed, to do entirely as she pleased, but for myself, I carried my infidelity to the length of an absolute superstition. I made an ostentation of it. I would rather have been in a hell than in a church on Sunday, and though I did not prevent my wife's instilling her own principles into the minds of our children, I, in turn, took especial care to deliver mine upon all occasions in their hearing, by which means I trusted to sow the seeds of that unprejudiced skepticism in which I prided myself, at least as early as my good little partner dropped those of her own gentle superstition into their infant minds. Had I had my own absurd and impious will in this matter, my children should have had absolutely no religious education whatsoever, and been left wholly unshackled to choose for themselves among all existing systems, infidelity included, precisely as chance, fancy, or interest might hereafter determine. It is not to be supposed that such a state of things did not afford her great uneasiness. Nevertheless, we were so very fond of one another, and in our humble way enjoyed so many blessings, that we were as entirely happy as any pair can be without the holy influence of religious sympathy. But the even flow of prosperity which had for so long gladdened my little household was not destined to last forever. It was ordained that I should experience the bitter truth of more than one of the wise man's proverbs, and first, especially, of that which declares that he that hateth suretyship is sure. I found myself involved, as how may have been before, by a good-natured friend, for more than £200. This agreeable intelligence was conveyed to me in an attorney's letter, which, to obviate unpleasant measures, considerately advised my paying the entire amount within just 1 week of the date of his pleasant epistle. Had I been called upon within that time to produce the Pitt diamond, or to make title to the Buckingham estates, the demand would have been just as easily complied with. I have no wish to bore my reader further with this little worry, a very serious one to me, however, and it will be enough to mention that the kindness of a friend extricated me from the clutches of the law by a timely advance, which, however, I was bound to replace within 2 years. To enable me to fulfill this engagement, my wife and I, after repeated consultations, resolved upon the course which resulted in the odd and unpleasant consequences which formed the subject of this narrative. We resolved to advertise for a lodger, with or without board, and see, and by resolutely submitting, for a single year, to the economy we had prescribed for ourselves, as well as to the annoyance of a stranger's intrusion, we calculated that at the end of that term we should have liquidated our debt. Accordingly, without losing time, we composed an advertisement in the most tempting phraseology we could devise, consistently with that economic laconism which the cost per line in the columns of the Times newspaper imposes upon the rhetoric of the advertising public. Somehow we were unlucky, for although we repeated our public notification 3 times in the course of a fortnight, we had but 2 applications. The one was from a clergyman in ill health, a man of great ability and zealous piety, whom we both knew by reputation, and who has since been called to his rest. My good little wife was very anxious that we should close with his offer, which was very considerably under what we had fixed upon, and I have no doubt that she was influenced by the hope that his talents and zeal might exert a happy influence upon my stubborn and unbelieving heart. For my part, his religious character displeased me. I did not wish my children's heads to be filled with mythic dogmas, for so I judged the doctrines of our holy faith and instinctively wished him away. I therefore declined his offer, and I have often since thought not quite so graciously as I ought to have done. The other offer, if so it can be called, was so very inadequate that we could not entertain it. I was now beginning to grow seriously uneasy. Our little project, so far from bringing in the gains on which we had calculated, had put me considerably out of pocket, for, independently of the cost of the advertisement I have mentioned, there were sundry little expenses involved in preparing for the meet reception of our expected inmate, which, under ordinary circumstances, we should not have dreamed of. Matters were in this posture, when an occurrence took place which immediately revived my flagging hopes. As we had no superfluity of servants, our children were early obliged to acquire habits of independence, and my little girl, then just 9 years of age, was frequently consigned with no other care than that of her own good sense, to the companionship of a little band of playmates, pretty similarly circumstanced, with whom it was her wont to play. Having one fine summer afternoon gone out as usual with these little companions, she did not return quite so soon as we had expected her. When she did so, she was out of breath, and excited. "Oh, Papa," she said, "I have seen such a nice old, kind gentleman, and he told me to tell you that he has a particular friend who wants a lodging in a quiet place, and that he thinks your house would suit him exactly, and ever so much more, and, look here, he gave me this." She opened her hand, and showed me a sovereign. "Well, "This does look promisingly," I said, my wife and I having first exchanged a smiling glance. "And what kind of gentleman was he, dear?" inquired she. "Was he well dressed? Whom was he like?" "He was not like anyone that I know," she answered, "but he had very nice new clothes on, and he was one of the fattest men I ever saw, and I am sure he is sick, for he looks very pale, and he had a crutch beside him." "Dear me, how strange!" exclaimed my wife, though, in truth there was nothing very wonderful in the matter. "Go on, child," I said, "let us hear it all out." "Well, Papa, he had such an immense yellow waistcoat!" "I never did see such a waistcoat," she resumed, "and he was sitting or leaning, I can't say which, against the bank of the green lane, I suppose to rest himself, for he seems very weak, poor gentleman." "And how did you happen to speak to him?" asked my wife. "When we were passing by, none of us saw him at all, but I suppose he heard them talking to me, and saying my name, for he said, 'Fanny, little Fanny.' So, that's your name. Come here, child, I have a question to ask you." "And so you went to him?" I said. "Yes," she continued, "he beckoned to me, and I did go over to him, but not very near, for I was greatly afraid of him at first." "Afraid? Dear, and why afraid?" asked I. "I was afraid, because he looked very old, very frightful, and as if he would hurt me." "What was there so old and frightful about him?" I asked. She paused and reflected a little, and then said, "His face was very large and pale, and it was looking upwards. It seemed very angry, I thought, but maybe it was angry from pain, and sometimes one side of it used to twitch and tremble for a minute, and then to grow quite still again, and all the time he was speaking to me, he never looked at me once, but always kept his face and eyes turned upwards, but his voice was very soft, and he called me little Fanny, and gave me this pound to buy toys with, so I was not so frightened in a little time, and then he sent a long message to you, Papa, and told me if I forgot it he would beat me, but I knew he was only joking, so that did not frighten me either." "And what was the message, my girl?" I asked, patting her pretty head with my hand. "Now, let me remember it all," she said, reflectively, "for he told it to me twice. He asked me if there was a good bedroom at the top of the house, standing by itself, and you know there is, so I told him so. It was exactly the kind of room that he described. And then he said that his friend would pay £200 a year for that bedroom, his board and attendance, and he told me to ask you, and have your answer when he should next meet me." £200! ejaculated my poor little wife. "Why, that is nearly twice as much as we expected. But did he say that his friend was sick, or very old, or that he had any servant to be supported also?" I asked. "Oh, no. He told me that he was quite able to take care of himself, and that he had, I think he called it, an asthma, but nothing else the matter, and that he would give no trouble at all. And that any friend who came to see him, he would see, not in the house, but only in the garden." "In the garden?" I echoed, laughing in spite of myself. "Yes, indeed he said so, and he told me to say that he would pay £100 when he came here, and the next 100 in 6 months, and so on," continued she. "Oh, ho! Half yearly in advance." "Better and better," said I, "and he bid me say, too, if you should ask about his character, that he is just as good as the master of the house himself," she added, and when he said that, he laughed a little. "Why, if he gives us £100 in advance," I answered, turning to my wife, "we are safe enough, for he will not find half that value in plate and jewels in the entire household, if he is disposed to rob us. So I see no reason against closing with the offer, should it be seriously meant. Do you, dear?" "Quite the contrary, love," said she. "I think it most desirable indeed, most providential." "Providential? My dear little bigot," I repeated, with a smile. "Well, be it so. I call it lucky merely, but, perhaps, you are happier in your faith, than I in my philosophy. Yes, you are grateful for the chance that I only rejoice at. You receive it as a proof of a divine and tender love, I as an accident. Delusions are often more elevating than truth," and so saying, I kissed away the saddened cloud that for a moment overcast her face. "Papa, he bid me be sure to have an answer for him when we meet again," resumed the child. "What shall I say to him when he asks me? Say that we agree to his proposal, my dear, or stay," I said, addressing my wife, "may it not be prudent to reduce what the child says to writing, and accept the offer so? This will prevent misunderstanding, as she may possibly have made some mistake." My wife agreed, and I wrote a brief note, stating that I was willing to receive an inmate upon the terms recounted by little Fanny, and which I distinctly specified, so that no mistake could possibly arise owing to the vagueness of what lawyers term a parole agreement. This important memorandum I placed in the hands of my little girl, who was to deliver it whenever the old gentleman in the yellow waistcoat that should chance to meet her. And all these arrangements completed, I awaited the issue of the affair with as much patience as I could affect. Meanwhile, my wife and I talked it over incessantly, and she, good little soul, almost wore herself to death in settling and unsettling the furniture and decorations of our expected inmates' apartments. Days passed away, days of hopes deferred, tedious and anxious. We were beginning to despond again, when one morning our little girl ran into the breakfast parlor, more excited even than she had been before, and fresh from a new interview with the gentleman in the yellow waistcoat. She had encountered him suddenly, pretty nearly where she had met him before, and the result was, that he had read the little note I have mentioned, and desired the child to inform me that his friend, Mr. Smith, would take possession of the apartments I proposed setting, on the terms agreed between us, that very evening. This evening, exclaimed my wife and I simultaneously, I full of the idea of making a first installment on the day following, she, of the 101 preparations which still remained to be completed, and so Smith is his name. Well, that does not tell us much, said I, but where did you meet your friend on this occasion, and how long is it since? Near the corner of the wallflower lane, so he indicated one which abounded in these fragrant plants. He was leaning with his back against the old tree you cut my name on, and his crutch was under his arm. But how long ago? I urged. Only this moment. I ran home as fast as I could, she replied. Why, you little blockhead, you should have told me that at first, I cried, snatching up my hat, and darting away in pursuit of the yellow waistcoat, whose acquaintance I not unnaturally coveted, inasmuch as a man who, for the first time, admits a stranger into his house, on the footing of permanent residence, desires generally to know a little more about him than that his name is Smith. The place indicated was only, as we say, a step away, and as Yellow Waistcoat was fat, and used a crutch, I calculated on easily overtaking him. I was, however, disappointed. Crutch, waistcoat, and all had disappeared. I climbed to the top of the wall, and from this commanding point of view made a sweeping observation, but in vain. I returned home, cursing my ill luck, the child's dullness, and the fat old fellow's activity. I need hardly say that Mr. Smith, in all his aspects, moral, social, physical, and monetary, formed a fruitful and interesting topic of speculation during dinner. How many phantom Smiths, short and long, stout and lean, ill-tempered and well-tempered, rich, respectable, or highly dangerous merchants, spies, forgers, nabobs, swindlers, danced before us, in the endless mazes of fanciful conjecture, during that anxious tete-a-tete, which was probably to be interrupted by the arrival of the gentleman himself. My wife and I puzzled over the problem as people would over the possible denouement of a French novel, and at last, by mutual consent, we came to the conclusion that Smith could, and would turn out to be no other than the good-natured valetudinarian in the yellow waistcoat himself, a humorist, as was evident enough, and a millionaire, as we unhesitatingly pronounced, who had no immediate relatives, and as I hoped, and my wife was certain, taken a decided fancy to our little Fanny. I patted the child's head with something akin to pride, as I thought of the magnificent, though remote possibilities, in store for her. Meanwhile, hour after hour stole away. It was a beautiful autumn evening, and the amber luster of the declining sun fell softly upon the yews and flowers, and gave an air, half melancholy, half cheerful, to the dark red brick piers surmounted with their cracked and grass-grown stone urns, and furnished with the light foliage of untended creeping plants. Down the short broad walk leading to this sombre entrance, my eye constantly wandered, but no impatient rattle on the latch, no battering at the gate, indicated the presence of a visitor, and the lazy bell hung dumbly among the honeysuckles. When will he come? Yellow Waistcoat promised this evening. It has been evening a good hour and a half, and yet he is not here. When will he come? It will soon be dark, the evening will have passed. Will he come at all? Such were the uneasy speculations which began to trouble us. Redder and duskier grew the light of the setting sun, till it saddened into the mists of night. Twilight came, and then darkness, and still no arrival, no summons at the gate. I would not admit even to my wife the excess of my own impatience. I could, however, stand it no longer, so I took my hat and walked to the gate, where I stood by the side of the public road, watching every vehicle and person that approached, in a fever of expectation. Even these, however, began to fail me, and the road grew comparatively quiet and deserted. Having kept guard like a sentinel for more than half an hour, I returned in no very good humor. With the punctuality of an expected inmate, ordered the servant to draw the curtains and secure the hall door, and so my wife and I sate down to our disconsolate cup of tea. It must have been about 10 o'clock, and we were both sitting silently working, I looking moodily into a paper and neither of us any longer entertaining a hope that anything but disappointment would come of the matter, when a sudden tapping, very loud and sustained, upon the window pane, startled us both in an instant from our reveries. I am not sure whether I mentioned before that the sitting room we occupied was upon the ground floor, and the sward came close under the window. I drew the curtains, and opened the shutters with a revived hope, and looking out, saw a very tall thin figure, a good deal wrapped up, standing about a yard before me, and motioning with head and hand impatiently towards the hall door. Though the night was clear, there was no moon, and therefore I could see no more than the black outline, like that of an Umberchinoi's figure, signing to me with mop and mow. In a moment I was at the hall door, candle in hand. The stranger stepped in, his long fingers clutched in the handle of a valise, and a bag which trailed upon the ground behind him. The light fell full upon him. He wore a long, well-made, black surtout, buttoned across, and which wrinkled and bagged about his lank figure. His hat was none of the best, and rather broad in the brim. A sort of white woolen muffler enveloped the lower part of his face. A pair of prominent green goggles, fenced round with leather, completely concealed his eyes, and nothing of the genuine man, but a little bit of yellow forehead, and a small transverse segment of equally yellow cheek and nose, encountered the curious gaze of your humble servant. You are, I suppose, I began, for I really was a little doubtful about my man. Mr. Smith the same. Be good enough to show me to my bedchamber, interrupted the stranger, brusquely, and in a tone which, spite of the muffler that enveloped his mouth, was sharp and grating enough. Ha! Mr. Smith, so I supposed. I hope you may find everything as comfortable as we desire to make it. I was about making a speech, but it was cut short by a slight bow, and a decisive gesture of the hand in the direction of the staircase. It was plain that the stranger hated ceremony. Together, accordingly, we mounted the staircase, he still pulling his luggage after him, and striding lightly up without articulating a word, and on reaching his bedroom, he immediately removed his hat, showing a sinister, black scratch wig underneath, and then began unrolling the mighty woolen wrapping of his mouth and chin. Come, thought I, we shall see something of your face after all. This something, however, proved to be very little, for under his muffler was a loose cravat, which stood up in front of his chin and upon his mouth. He wore a respirator, an instrument which I had never seen before, and of the use of which I was wholly ignorant. There was something so excessively odd in the effect of this piece of unknown mechanism upon his mouth, surmounted by the huge goggles which encased his eyes, that I believe I should have laughed outright, were it not for a certain unpleasant and peculiar impressiveness in the tout ensemble of the narrow-chested, long-limbed, and cadaverous figure in black. As it was, we stood looking at one another in silence for several seconds. Thank you, sir, at last he said, abruptly. I shan't want anything whatever tonight, if you can only spare me this candle. I assented, and, becoming more communicative, he added, I am, though an invalid, an independent sort of fellow enough. I am a bit of a philosopher. I am my own servant, and, I hope, my own master, too. I rely upon myself in matters of the body and of the mind. I place valets and priests in the same category, fellows who live by our laziness, intellectual or corporeal. I am a Voltaire, without his luxuries, a Robinson Crusoe, without his Bible and anchorite, without a superstition. In short, my indulgence is asceticism, and my faith in fidelity. Therefore, I shan't disturb your servants much with my bell, nor yourselves with my psalmody. You have got a rational lodger, who knows how to attend upon himself. During this singular address he was drawing off his ill-fitting black gloves, and when he had done so, a bank-note, which had been slipped underneath for safety, remained in his hand. Punctuality, sir, is one of my poor pleasures, he said. Will you allow me to enjoy it now? Tomorrow you may acknowledge this. I should not rest were you to decline it. He extended his bony and discolored fingers, and placed the note in my hand. Oh, Fortune and Plutus! It was a £100 bank-note. Pray, not one word, my dear sir, he continued, unbending still further. It is simply done pursuant to agreement. We shall know one another better, I hope, in a little time. You will find me always equally punctual. At present pray give yourself no further trouble. I require nothing more. Good night. I returned the valediction, closed his door, and groped my way down the stairs. It was not until I had nearly reached the hall, that I recollected that I had omitted to ask our new inmate at what hour he would desire to be called in the morning, and so I groped my way back again. As I reached the lobby on which his chamber opened, I perceived a long line of light issuing from the partially opened door, within which stood Mr. Smith, the same odd figure I had just left. while along the boards was creeping towards him across the lobby, a great, big-headed, buff-colored cat. I had never seen this ugly animal before, and it had reached the threshold of his door, arching its back, and rubbing itself on the post, before either appeared conscious of my approach, when, with an angry growl, it sprang into the stranger's room. "What do you want?" he demanded, sharply, standing in the doorway. I explained my errand. "I shall call myself," was his sole reply, and he shut the door with a crash that indicated no very pleasurable emotions. I cared very little about my lodger's temper. The stealthy rustle of his banknote in my waistcoat pocket was music enough to sweeten the harshest tones of his voice, and to keep alive a cheerful good humor in my heart, and although there was, indisputably, something queer about him, I was, on the whole, very well pleased with my bargain. The next day our new inmate did not ring his bell until noon. As soon as he had had some breakfast, of which he very sparingly partook, he told the servant that, for the future, he desired that a certain quantity of milk and bread might be left outside his door, and this being done, he would dispense with regular meals. He desired, too, that, on my return, I should be acquainted that he wished to see me in his own room at about 9 o'clock, and, meanwhile, he directed that he should be left undisturbed. I found my little wife full of astonishment at Mr. Smith's strange frugality and seclusion, and very curious to learn the object of the interview he had desired with me. At 9 o'clock I repaired to his room. I found him in precisely the costume in which I had left him, the same green goggles, the same muffling of the mouth, except that being now no more than a broadly folded black silk handkerchief, very loose, and covering even the lower part of the nose. It was obviously intended for the sole purpose of concealment. It was plain I was not to see more of his features than he had chosen to disclose at our first interview. The effect was as if the lower part of his face had some hideous wound or sore. He closed the door with his own hand on my entrance, nodded slightly, and took his seat. I expected him to begin, but he was so long silent that I was at last constrained to address him. I said, for want of something more to the purpose, that I hoped he had not been tormented by the strange cat the night before. "What cat?" he asked, abruptly. "What the plague do you mean?" "Why, I certainly did see a cat go into your room last night," I resumed. "Hey, and what if you did, though I fancy you dreamed it? I'm not afraid of a cat, are you?" he interrupted, tartly. At this moment there came a low growling mew from the closet which opened from the room in which we sat. "Talk of the devil," said I, pointing towards the closet. My companion, without any exact change of expression, looked, I thought, somehow still more sinister and lowering, and I felt for a moment a sort of superstitious misgiving, which made the rest of the sentence die away on my lips. Perhaps Mr. Smith perceived this, for he said, in a tone calculated to reassure me, "Well, sir, I think I am bound to tell you that I like my apartments very well. They suit me, and I shall probably be your tenant for much longer than at first you anticipated." I expressed my gratification. He then began to talk, something in the strain in which he had spoken of his own peculiarities of habit and thinking upon the previous evening. He disposed of all classes and denominations of superstition with an easy sarcastic slang, which for me was so captivating, that I soon lost all reserve, and found myself listening and suggesting by turns, acquiescent and pleased, sometimes hazarding dissent, but whenever I did, foiled and floored by a few pointed satirical sentences, whose sophistry, for such I must now believe it, confounded me with a rapidity which, were it not for the admiration with which he had insensibly inspired me, would have piqued and irritated my vanity not a little. While this was going on, from time to time the mewing and growling of a cat within the closet became more and more audible. At last these sounds became so loud, accompanied by scratching at the door, that I paused in the midst of a sentence, and observed, "There certainly is a cat shut up in the closet." "Is there?" he ejaculated, in a surprised tone. "Nay, I do not hear it." He rose abruptly and approached the door. His back was towards me, but I observed he raised the goggles which usually covered his eyes, and looked steadfastly at the closet door. The angry sounds all died away into a low, protracted growl, which again subsided into silence. He continued in the same attitude for some moments, and then returned. "I do not hear it," he said, as he resumed his place, and taking a book from his capacious pocket, asked me if I had seen it before. I never had, and this surprised me, for I had flattered myself that I knew, at least by name, every work published in England during the last 50 years in favor of the philosophy in which we both delighted. The book, moreover, was an odd one, as both its title and table of contents demonstrated. While we were discoursing upon these subjects, I became more and more distinctly conscious of a new class of sounds proceeding from the same closet. I plainly heard a measured and heavy tread, accompanied by the tapping of some hard and heavy substance like the end of a staff, pass up and down the floor first, as it seemed, stealthily, and then more and more unconcealedly. I began to feel very uncomfortable and suspicious. As the noise proceeded, and became more and more unequivocal, Mr. Smith abruptly rose, opened the closet door, just enough to admit his own lath-like person, and steal within the threshold for some seconds. What he did I could not see. I felt conscious he had an associate concealed there, and though my eyes remained fixed on the book, I could not avoid listening for some audible words, or signal of caution. I heard, however, nothing of the kind. Mr. Smith turned back, walked a step or two towards me, and said, "I fancied I heard a sound from that closet, but there is nothing whatever. Bring the candle, let us both look." I obeyed with some little trepidation, for I fully anticipated that I should detect the intruder, of whose presence my own ears had given me, for nearly half an hour, the most unequivocal proofs. We entered the closet together. It contained but a few chairs and a small spider table. At the far end of the room there was a sort of grey woolen cloth upon the floor, and a bundle of something underneath it. I looked jealously at it, and half thought I could trace the outline of a human figure, but, if so, it was perfectly motionless. "Some of my poor wardrobe," he muttered, as he pointed his lean finger in the direction. "It did not sound like a cat, did it? Hey, did it?" he muttered, and without attending to my answer, he went about the apartment, clapping his hands, and crying, "Dish dish dish." The game, however, whatever it was, did not start. As I entered I had seen, however, a large crutch reposing against the wall in the corner opposite to the door. This was the only article in the room, except that I have mentioned, with which I was not familiar. With the exception of our two selves, there was not a living creature to be seen there, no shadow but ours upon the bare walls, no feet but our own upon the comfortless floor. I had never before felt so strange and unpleasant a sensation. "There is nothing unusual in the room but that crutch," I said. "What crutch, you dolt?" "I see no crutch," he ejaculated, in a tone of sudden but suppressed fury. "Why, that crutch," I answered, for somehow I neither felt nor resented his rudeness, turning and pointing to the spot where I had seen it. It was gone! It was neither there nor anywhere else. It must have been an illusion, rather an odd one, to be sure. And yet I could at this moment, with a safe conscience, swear that I never saw an object more distinctly than I had seen it but a second before. My companion was muttering fast to himself as we withdrew. His presence rather scared than reassured me, and I felt something almost amounting to horror, as, holding the candle above his cadaverous and sable figure, he stood at his threshold, while I descended the stairs, and said, in a sort of whisper, "Why, but that I am, like yourself, a philosopher, I should say that your house is a ha. Ha. Ha! Haunted. You look very pale, my love," said my wife, as I entered the drawing room, where she had been long awaiting my return. "Nothing unpleasant has happened?" "Nothing, I assure you." "Pale!" "Do I look pale?" I answered. "We are excellent friends, I assure you. So far from having had the smallest disagreement, there is every prospect of our agreeing but too well, as you will say, for I find that he holds all my opinions upon speculative subjects. We have had a great deal of conversation this evening, I assure you, and I never met, I think, so scholarlike and able a man. I am sorry for it, dearest," she said, sadly. "The greater his talents, if such be his opinions, the more dangerous a companion is he." We turned, however, to more cheerful topics, and it was late before we retired to rest. I believe it was pride, perhaps only vanity, but, at all events, some obstructive and stubborn instinct of my nature, which I could not overcome, that prevented my telling my wife the odd occurrences which had disturbed my visit to our guest. I was unable or ashamed to confess that so slight a matter had disturbed me, and, above all, that any accident could possibly have clouded, even for a moment, the frosty clearness of my pure and lofty skepticism with the shadows of superstition. Almost every day seemed to develop some new eccentricity of our strange guest. His dietary consisted, without any variety or relief, of the monotonous bread and milk with which he started. His bed had not been made for nearly a week. Nobody had been admitted into his room since my visit, just described, and he never ventured downstairs, or out of doors, until after nightfall, when he used sometimes to glide swiftly round our little enclosed shrubbery, and at others stand quite motionless, composed, as if in an attitude of deep attention. After employing about an hour in this way, he would return, and steal upstairs to his room, when he would shut himself up, and not be seen again until the next night, or, it might be, the night after that, when, perhaps, he would repeat his odd excursion. Strange as his habits were, their eccentricity was all upon the side least troublesome to us. He required literally no attendance, and as to his occasional night ramble, even it caused not the slightest disturbance of our routine hour for securing the house and locking up the hall door for the night, inasmuch as he had invariably retired before that hour arrived. All this stimulated curiosity, and, in no small degree, that of my wife, who, notwithstanding her vigilance and her anxiety to see our strange inmate, had been hitherto foiled by a series of cross accidents. We were sitting together somewhere about 10 o'clock at night, when there came a tap at the room door. We had just been discussing the unaccountable Smith, and I felt a sheepish consciousness that he might be himself at the door, and have possibly even overheard our speculation, some of them anything but complimentary, respecting himself. "Come in," cried I, with an effort, and the tall form of our lodger glided into the room. My wife was positively frightened, and stood looking at him, as he advanced, with a stare of manifest apprehension, and even recoiled mechanically, and caught my hand. Sensitiveness, however, was not his fault. He made a kind of stiff nod as I mumbled an introduction, and seating himself unasked, began at once to chat in that odd, offhand, and sneering style, in which he excelled, and which had, as he wielded it, a sort of fascination of which I can pretend to convey no idea. My wife's alarm subsided, and although she still manifestly felt some sort of misgiving about our visitor, she yet listened to his conversation, and, spite of herself, soon began to enjoy it. He stayed for nearly half an hour. But although he glanced at a great variety of topics, he did not approach the subject of religion. As soon as he was gone, my wife delivered judgment upon him in form. She admitted he was agreeable, but then he was such an unnatural, awful-looking object. There was, besides, something indescribably frightful, she thought, in his manner. The very tone of his voice was strange and hateful, and, on the whole, she felt unutterably relieved at his departure. A few days after, on my return, I found my poor little wife agitated and dispirited. Mr. Smith had paid her a visit, and brought with him a book, which he stated he had been reading, and which contained some references to the Bible which he begged of her to explain in that profounder and less obvious sense in which they had been cited. This she had endeavored to do, and affecting to be much gratified by her satisfactory exposition. He had requested her to reconcile some discrepancies which he said had often troubled him when reading the scriptures. Some of them were quite new to my good little wife. They startled and even horrified her. He pursued this theme, still pretending only to seek for information to quiet his own doubts, while in reality he was sowing in her mind the seeds of the first perturbations that had ever troubled the sources of her peace. He had been with her, she thought, no more than a quarter of an hour, but he had contrived to leave her abundant topics on which to ruminate for days. I found her shocked and horrified at the doubts which this potent magus had summoned from the pit, doubts which she knew not how to combat, and from the torment of which she could not escape. He has made me very miserable with his deceitful questions. I never thought of them before, and, merciful heaven, I cannot answer them. What am I to do? My serenity is gone. I shall never be happy again. In truth, she was so very miserable, and, as it seemed to me, so disproportionately excited, that, inconsistent in me as the task would have been, I would gladly have explained away her difficulties, and restored to her mind its wonted confidence and serenity, had I possessed sufficient knowledge for the purpose. I really pitied her, and heartily wished Mr. Smith, for the nonce, at the devil. I observed after this that my wife's spirits appeared permanently affected. There was a constantly recurring anxiety, and I thought something was lying still more heavily at her heart than the uncertainties inspired by our lodger. One evening, as we two were sitting together, after a long silence, she suddenly laid her hand upon my arm, and said, "Oh, Richard, my darling. Would to God you could pray for me." There was something so agitated, and even terrified, in her manner, that I was absolutely startled. I urged her to disclose whatever preyed upon her mind. "You can't sympathize with me, you can't help me, you can scarcely compassionate me in my misery. Oh, dearest Richard. Some evil influence has been gaining upon my heart, dulling and destroying my convictions, killing all my holy affections, and absolutely transforming me. I look inward upon myself with amazement, with terror, with oh God exclamation mark, with actual despair." Saying this, she threw herself on her knees, and wept an agonized flood of tears, with her head reposing in my lap. Poor little thing, my heart bled for her. But what could I do or say? All I could suggest was what I really thought, that she was unwell, hysterical, and needed to take better care of her precious self, that her change of feeling was fancied, not real, and that a few days would restore her to her old health and former spirits and serenity. "And sometimes," she resumed, after I had ended a consolatory discussion, which it was but too manifest had fallen unprofitably upon her ear. Such dreadful, impious thoughts come into my mind, whether I choose it or not. They come, and stay, and return, strive as I may, and I can't pray against them. They are forced upon me with the strength of an independent will, and horrible frightful, they blaspheme the character of God himself. They upbraid the Almighty upon his throne, and I can't pray against them. There is something in me now that resists prayer. There was such a real and fearful anguish in the agitation of my gentle companion, that it shook my very soul within me, even while I was affecting to make light of her confessions. I had never before witnessed a struggle at all like this, and I was awestruck at the spectacle. At length she became comparatively calm. I did gradually succeed, though very imperfectly, in reassuring her. She strove hard against her depression, and recovered a little of her wonted cheerfulness. After a while, however, the cloud returned. She grew sad and earnest, though no longer excited, and entreated, or rather implored, of me to grant her one special favor, and this was, to avoid the society of our lodger. I never, she said, could understand till now the instinctive dread with which poor Margaret, in Faust, shrinks from the hateful presence of Mephistopheles. I now feel it in myself. The dislike and suspicion I first felt for that man Smith, or whatever else he may call himself, has grown into literal detestation and terror. I hate him, I am afraid of him. I never knew what anguish of mind was until he entered our doors, and would to God he were gone. I reasoned with her, kissed her, laughed at her, but could not dissipate, in the least degree, the intense and preternatural horror with which she had grown to regard the poor philosophic invalid, who was probably, at that moment, poring over some metaphysical book in his solitary bedchamber. The circumstance I am about to mention will give you some notion of the extreme to which these excited feelings had worked upon her nerves. I was that night suddenly awakened by a piercing scream. I started upright in the bed, and saw my wife standing at the bedside, white as ashes with terror. It was some seconds, so startled was I, before I could find words to ask her the cause of her affright. She caught my wrist in her icy grasp, and climbed, trembling violently, into bed. Notwithstanding my repeated entreaties, she continued for a long time stupefied and dumb. At length, however, she told me, that having lain awake for a long time, she felt, on a sudden, that she could pray, and lighting the candle, she had stolen from beside me, and kneeled down for the purpose. She had, however, scarcely assumed the attitude of prayer, when somebody, she said, clutched her arm violently near the wrist, and she heard, at the same instant, some blasphemous menace, the import of which escaped her the moment it was spoken, muttered close in her ear. This terrifying interruption was the cause of the scream which had awakened me, and the condition in which she continued during the remainder of the night confirmed me more than ever in the conviction, that she was suffering under some morbid action of the nervous system. After this event, which I had no hesitation in attributing to fancy, she became literally afraid to pray, and her misery and despondency increased proportionately. It was shortly after this that an unusual pressure of business called me into town one evening after office hours. I had left my dear little wife tolerably well, and little Fanny was to be her companion until I returned. She and her little companion occupied the same room in which we sat on the memorable evening which witnessed the arrival of our eccentric guest. Though usually a lively child, it most provokingly happened upon this night that Fanny was heavy and drowsy to excess. Her mamma would have sent her to bed, but that she now literally feared to be left alone, although, however, she could not so far overcome her horror of solitude as to do this, she yet would not persist in combating the poor child's sleepiness. Accordingly, little Fanny was soon locked in a sound sleep, while her mamma quietly pursued her work beside her. They had been perhaps some 10 minutes thus circumstanced, when my wife heard the window softly raised from without. A bony hand parted the curtains, and Mr. Smith leaned into the room. She was so utterly overpowered at sight of this apparition, that even had it, as she expected, climbed into the room, she told me she could not have uttered a sound, or stirred from the spot where she sat transfixed and petrified. "Ha, ha," he said gently, "I hope you'll excuse this, I must admit, very odd intrusion, but I knew I should find you here, and could not resist the opportunity of raising the window just for a moment, to look in upon a little family picture, and say a word to yourself. I understand that you are troubled, because for some cause you cannot say your prayers, because what you call your faith is, so to speak, dead and gone, and also because what you consider bad thoughts are constantly recurring to your mind. Now, all that is very silly. If it is really impossible for you to believe and to pray, what are you to infer from that? It is perfectly plain your Christian system can't be a true one. Faith and prayer it everywhere represents as the conditions of grace, acceptance, and salvation, and yet your Creator will not permit you either to believe or pray. The Christian system is, forsooth, a free gift, and yet He who formed you and it, makes it absolutely impossible for you to accept it. Is it, I ask you, from your own experience, is it a free gift? And if your own experience, in which you can't be mistaken, gives its pretensions the lie, why, in the name of common sense, will you persist in believing it? I say it is downright blasphemy to think it has emanated from the good spirit, assuming that there is one. It tells you that you must be tormented hereafter in a way only to be made intelligible by the image of eternal fires. Pretty strong, we must all allow, unless you comply with certain conditions, which it pretends are so easy that it is a positive pleasure to embrace and perform them, and yet, for the life of you, you can't do either. Is this truth and mercy ? Or is it swindling and cruelty? Is it the part of the Redeemer, or that of the tyrant, deceiver, and tormentor? Up to that moment, my wife had sat breathless and motionless, listening, in the catalepsy of nightmare, to a sort of echo of the vile and impious reasoning which had haunted her for so long. At the last words of the sentence his voice became harsh and thrilling, and his whole manner bespoke a sort of crouching and terrific hatred, the like of which she could not have conceived. Whatever may have been the cause, she was on a sudden disenchanted. She started to her feet, and, freezing with horror though she was, in a shrill cry of agony commanded him, in the name of God, to depart from her. His whole frame seemed to darken. He drew back silently. The curtains dropped into their places. The window was let down again as stealthily as it had just been raised, and my wife found herself alone in the chamber with our little child, who had been startled from her sleep by her mother's cry of anguish, and with the fearful words, "Tempter, destroyer, devil," still ringing in her ears, was weeping bitterly, and holding her terrified mother's hand. There is nothing, I believe, more infectious than that species of nervousness which shows itself in superstitious fears. I began, although I could not bring myself to admit anything the least like it, to partake insensibly, but strongly, of the peculiar feelings with which my wife, and indeed my whole household, already regarded the lodger upstairs. The fact was, beside, that the state of my poor wife's mind began to make me seriously uneasy, and, although I was fully sensible of the pecuniary and other advantages attendant upon his stay, they were yet far from outweighing the constant gloom and frequent misery in which the protracted sojourn was involving my once cheerful house. I resolved, therefore, at whatever monetary sacrifice, to put an end to these commotions, and, after several debates with my wife, in which the subject was, as usual, turned in all its possible and impossible bearings, we agreed that, deducting a fair proportion for his 5 weeks' sojourn, I should return the remainder of his £100, and request immediate possession of his apartments. Like a man suddenly relieved of an insufferable load, and breathing freely once more, I instantly prepared to carry into effect the result of our deliberations. In pursuance of this resolution, I waited upon Mr. Smith. This time my call was made in the morning, somewhere about 9 o'clock. He received me at his door, standing as usual in the stealthy opening which barely admitted his lank person. There he stood, fully equipped with goggles and respirator, and swathed, rather than dressed, in his puckered black garments. As he did not seem disposed to invite me into his apartment, although I had announced my visit as one of business, I was obliged to open my errand where I stood, and after a great deal of fumbling and muttering, I contrived to place before him distinctly the resolution to which I had come. "But I can't think of taking back any portion of the sum I have paid you," said he, with a cool, dry emphasis. "Your reluctance to do so, Mr. Smith, is most handsome, and I assure you, appreciated," I replied. "It is very generous, but, at the same time, it is quite impossible for me to accept what I have no right to take, and I must beg of you not to mention that part of the subject again." "And why should I take it?" demanded Mr. Smith. "Because you have paid this £100 for 6 months, and you are leaving me with nearly 5 months of the term still unexpired," I replied. "I expect to receive fair play myself, and always give it, but who on earth said that I was going away so soon?" pursued Mr. Smith, in the same dry, sarcastic key. "I have not said so because I really don't intend it. I mean to stay here to the last day of the 6 months for which I have paid you. I have no notion of vacating my hired lodgings, simply because you say, go. I shan't quarrel with you. I never quarrel with anybody. I'm as much your friend as ever, but, without the least wish to disoblige, I can't do this, positively I cannot." "Is there anything else?" I had not anticipated in the least the difficulty which thus encountered and upset our plans. I had so set my heart upon effecting the immediate retirement of our inauspicious inmate, that the disappointment literally stunned me for a moment. I, however, returned to the charge. I urged, and prayed, and almost besought him to give up his apartments, and to leave us. I offered to repay every farthing of the sum he had paid me, reserving nothing on account of the time he had already been with us. I suggested all the disadvantages of the house. I shifted my ground, and told him that my wife wanted the rooms. I pressed his gallantry, his good nature, his economy. In short, I assailed him upon every point, but in vain. He did not even take the trouble of repeating what he had said before. He neither relented, nor showed the least irritation, but simply said, "I can't do this, here I am, and here I stay until the half-year has expired. You wanted a lodger, and you have got one, the quietest, least troublesome, least expensive person you could have, and though your house, servants, and furniture are none of the best, I don't care for that. I pursue my own poor business and enjoyments here entirely to my satisfaction." Having thus spoken, he gave me a sort of nod, and closed the door. So, instead of getting rid of him the next day, as we had hoped, we had nearly 5 months more of his company in expectancy. I hated, and my wife dreaded the prospect. She was literally miserable and panic-struck at her disappointment, and grew so nervous and wretched that I made up my mind to look out for lodgings for her and the children, subversive of all our schemes of retrenchment as such a step would be, and surrendering the house absolutely to Mr. Smith and the servants during the remainder of his term. Circumstances, however, occurred to prevent our putting this plan in execution. My wife, meanwhile, was, if possible, more depressed and nervous every day. The servants seemed to sympathize in the dread and gloom which involved ourselves. The very children grew timid and spiritless, without knowing why, and the entire house was pervaded with an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear. A poorhouse or a dungeon would have been cheerful, compared with a dwelling haunted unceasingly with unearthly suspicions and alarms. I would have made any sacrifice short of ruin, to emancipate our household from the odious mental and moral thraldom which was invisibly established over us, overcasting us with strange anxieties and an undefined terror. About this time my wife had a dream which troubled her much, although she could not explain its supposed significance satisfactorily by any of the ordinary rules of interpretation in such matters. The vision was as follows. She dreamed that we were busily employed in carrying out our scheme of removal, and that I came into the parlor where she was making some arrangements, and, with rather an agitated manner, told her that the carriage had come for the children. She thought she went out to the hall, in consequence, holding little Fanny by one hand, and the boy, or, as we still called him, baby, by the other, and feeling, as she did so, an unaccountable gloom, almost amounting to terror, steal over her. The children, too, seemed, she thought, frightened, and disposed to cry. So close to the hall door as to exclude the light, stood some kind of vehicle, of which she could see nothing but that its door was wide open, and the interior involved in total darkness. The children, she thought, shrunk back in great trepidation, and she addressed herself to induce them, by persuasion, to enter, telling them that they were only going to their new home. So, in a while, little Fanny approached it, but, at the same instant, some person came swiftly up from behind, and, raising the little boy in his hands, said fiercely, "No, the baby first," and placed him in the carriage. This person was our lodger, Mr. Smith, and was gone as soon as seen. My wife, even in her dream, could not act or speak, but as the child was lifted into the carriage door, a man, whose face was full of beautiful tenderness and compassion, leaned forward from the carriage and received the little child, which, stretching his arms to the stranger, looked back with a strange smile upon his mother. "He is safe with me, and I will deliver him to you when you come." These words the man spoke, looking upon her, as he received him, and immediately the carriage door shut, and the noise of its closing wakened my wife from her nightmare. This dream troubled her very much, and even haunted my mind unpleasantly too. We agreed, however, not to speak of it to anybody, not to divulge any of our misgivings respecting the stranger. We were anxious that neither the children nor the servants should catch the contagion of those fears which had seized upon my poor little wife, and, if truth were spoken, upon myself in some degree also. But this precaution was, I believe, needless, for, as I said before, everybody under the same roof with Mr. Smith was, to a certain extent, affected with the same nervous gloom and apprehension, and now commences a melancholy chapter in my life. My poor little Fanny was attacked with a cough which soon grew very violent, and after a time degenerated into a sharp attack of inflammation. We were seriously alarmed for her life, and nothing that care and medicine could effect was spared to save it. Her mother was indefatigable, and scarcely left her night or day, and, indeed, For some time, we all but despaired of her recovery. One night, when she was at the worst, her poor mother, who had sat for many a melancholy hour listening, by her bedside, to those plaintive incoherences of delirium and moanings of fever, which have harrowed so many a fond heart, gained gradually from her very despair the courage which she had so long wanted, and knelt down at the side of her sick darling's bed to pray for her deliverance. With clasped hands, in an agony of supplication, she prayed that God would, in his mercy, spare her little child, that, justly as she herself deserved the sorest chastisement his hand could inflict, he would yet deal patiently and tenderly with her in this one thing. She poured out her sorrows before the mercy seat. She opened her heart, and declared her only hope to be in his pity, without which, she felt that her darling would only leave the bed where she was lying for her grave. Exactly as she came to this part of her supplication, the child, who had grown, as it seemed, more and more restless, and moaned and muttered with increasing pain and irritation, on a sudden started upright in her bed, and, in a thrilling voice, cried, "No! No!" Exclamation marked the baby first. The mysterious sentence which had secretly tormented her for so long, thus piercingly uttered by this delirious, and, perhaps, dying child, with what seemed a preternatural earnestness and strength, arrested her devotions, and froze her with a feeling akin to terror. "Hush, hush, my darling," said the poor mother, almost wildly, as she clasped the attenuated frame of the sick child in her arms. "Hush, my darling, don't cry out so loudly for my own love." The child did not appear to see or hear her, but sat up still with feverish cheeks, and bright unsteady eyes, while her dry lips were muttering inaudible words. "Lie down, my sweet child, lie down, for your own mother," she said. "If you tire yourself, you can't grow well, and your poor mother will lose you." At these words, the child suddenly cried out again, in precisely the same loud, strong voice, "No! No! The baby first, and immediately afterwards lay down, and fell, for the first time since her illness, into a tranquil sleep. My good little wife sat, crying bitterly by her bedside. The child was better. That was, indeed, delightful. But then there was an omen in the words, thus echoed from her dream, which she dared not trust herself to interpret, and which yet had seized, with a grasp of iron, upon every fibre of her brain. "Oh, Richard," she cried, as she threw her arms about my neck, "I am terrified at this horrible menace from the unseen world. Oh, poor, darling little baby, I shall lose you. I am sure I shall lose you. Comfort me, darling, and say he is not to die." And so I did, and tasked all my powers of argument and persuasion to convince her how unsubstantial was the ground of her anxiety. The little boy was perfectly well, and, even were he to die before his sister, that event might not occur for 70 years to come. I could not, however, conceal from myself that there was something odd and unpleasant in the coincidence, and my poor wife had grown so nervous and excitable, that a much less ominous conjecture would have sufficed to alarm her. Meanwhile, the unaccountable terror which our lodger's presence inspired continued to increase. One of our maids gave us warning, solely from her dread of our queer inmate, and the strange accessories which haunted him. She said, and this was corroborated by her fellow servant, that Mr. Smith seemed to have constantly a companion in his room, that although they never heard them speak, they continually and distinctly heard the tread of two persons walking up and down the room together, and described accurately the peculiar sound of a stick or crutch tapping upon the floor, which my own ears had heard. They also had seen the large, ill-conditioned cat I have mentioned, frequently steal in and out of the stranger's room, and observed that when our little girl was in greatest danger, the hateful animal was constantly writhing, fawning, and crawling about the door of the sick room after nightfall. They were thoroughly persuaded that this ill-omened beast was the foul fiend himself, and I confess I could not skeptic as I was bring myself absolutely to the belief that he was nothing more than a harmless, necessary cat. These and similar reports, implicitly believed as they palpably were by those who made them, were certainly little calculated to allay the perturbation and alarm with which our household was filled. The evenings had by this time shortened very much, and darkness often overtook us before we sat down to our early tea. It happened just at this period of which I have been speaking, after my little girl had begun decidedly to mend, that I was sitting in our dining parlour, with my little boy fast asleep upon my knees, and thinking of I know not what, my wife having gone upstairs, as usual, to sit in the room with little Fanny. As I thus sat in what was to me, in effect, total solitude, darkness unperceived stole on us. On a sudden, as I sat, with my elbow leaning upon the table, and my other arm round the sleeping child, I felt, as I thought, a cold current of air faintly blowing upon my forehead. I raised my head, and saw, as nearly as I could calculate, at the far end of the table on which my arm rested, 2 large green eyes confronting me. I could see no more, but instantly concluded they were those of the abominable cat. Yielding to an impulse of horror and abhorrence, I caught a watercraft that was close to my hand, and threw it full at it with all my force. I must have missed my object, for the shining eyes continued fixed for a second, and then glided still nearer to me, and then a little nearer still. The noise of the glass smashed with so much force upon the table called in the servant, who happened to be passing. She had a candle in her hand, and, perhaps, the light alarmed the odious beast, for as she came in it was gone. I had had an undefined idea that its approach was somehow connected with a designed injury of some sort to the sleeping child. I could not be mistaken as to the fact that I had plainly seen the 2 broad, glaring, green eyes. Where the cursed animal had gone I had not observed. It might, indeed, easily have run out at the door as the servant opened it, but neither of us had seen it do so, and we were every one of us in such a state of nervous excitement, that even this incident was something in the catalogue of our ambiguous experiences. It was a great happiness to see our darling little Fanny every day mending, and now quite out of danger. This was cheering and delightful. It was also something to know that more than 2 months of our lodger's term of occupation had already expired, and to realize, as we now could do, by anticipation, the unspeakable relief of his departure. My wife strove hard to turn our dear child's recovery to good account for me. But the impressions of fear soon depart, and those of religious gratitude must be preceded by religious faith. All as yet was but as seeds strewn upon the rock. Little Fanny, though recovering rapidly, was still very weak, and her mother usually passed a considerable part of every evening in her bedroom, for the child was sometimes uneasy and restless at night. It happened at this period that, sitting as usual at Fanny's bedside, she witnessed an occurrence which agitated her not a little. The child had been, as it seems, growing sleepy, and was lying listlessly, with eyes half open, apparently taking no note of what was passing. Suddenly, however, with an expression of the wildest terror, she drew up her limbs, and cowered in the bed's head, gazing at some object, which, judging from the motion of her eyes, must have been slowly advancing from the end of the room next the door. The child made a low shuddering cry, as she grasped her mother's hand, and, with features white and tense with terror, slowly following with her eyes the noiseless course of some unseen spectre, shrinking more and more fearfully backward every moment. "What is it? Where? What is it that frightens you, my darling?" asked the poor mother, who, thrilled with horror, looked in vain for the apparition which seemed to have all but bereft the child of reason. "Stay with me, save me, keep it away, look at it making signs to me, don't let it hurt me, it is angry, oh. Mama, save me, save me." The child said this, all the time clinging to her with both her hands, in an ecstasy of panic. "There, my darling," said my poor wife, "don't be afraid, there's nothing but me, your own Mama, and little baby in the room. Nothing, my darling, nothing indeed. Mama, don't move, don't go near him," the child continued wildly. "It's only his back now, don't make him turn again, he's untying his handkerchief. Oh, baby, he'll kill baby. And he's lifting up those green things from his eyes, don't you see him doing it? Mama, why does he come here? Oh, Mama, poor baby, poor little baby." She was looking with a terrified gaze at the little boy's bed, which lay directly opposite to her own, and in which he was sleeping calmly. "Hush, my darling child," said my wife, with difficulty restraining an hysterical burst of tears. "For God's sake don't speak so wildly, my own precious love, there don't be frightened there, darling, there. Oh, poor baby, poor little darling baby," the child continued as before. "Will no one save him? Tell that wicked man to go away. Oh, the why, Mama, don't. Oh, sure you won't let him. Don't, he'll take the child's life. Will you let him lie down that way on the bed? Save poor little baby. Oh, baby, waken, his head is on your face." As she said this she raised her voice to a cry of despairing terror which made the whole room ring again. This cry, or rather yell, reached my ears as I sat reading in the parlor by myself, and fearing I knew not what, I rushed to the apartment. Before I reached it, the sound had subsided into low but violent sobbing, and, just as I arrived at the threshold, I heard, close at my feet, a fierce protracted growl, and something rubbing along the subbase. I was in the dark, but, with a feeling of mingled terror and fury, I stamped and struck at the abhorred brute with my feet, but in vain. The next moment I was in the room, and heard little Fanny, through her sobs, cry, "Oh, poor baby is killed, that wicked man has killed him." He uncovered his face, and put it on him, and lay upon the bed and killed poor baby. I knew he came to kill him. "Ah, Papa, why did you not come up before he went? He is gone, He went away as soon as he killed our poor little darling baby. I could not conceal my agitation, quite, and I said to my wife, "Has he, Smith, been here?" "No." "What is it, then?" "The child has seen someone." "Seen whom?" Who has been here?" "I did not see it. But I am sure the child saw, that is, thought she saw him, the person you have named." "Oh, God, in mercy deliver us. What shall I do, what shall I do?" Thus saying, the dear little woman burst into tears, and crying, as if her heart would break, sobbed out an entreaty that I would look at baby, adding, that she herself had not courage to see whether her darling was sleeping or dead. "Dead!" I exclaimed. "Tut, tut, my darling, you must not give way to such morbid fancies. He is very well, I see him breathing." And so saying, I went over to the bed where our little boy was lying. He was slumbering, though it seemed to me very heavily, and his cheeks were flushed, sleeping tranquilly, my darling, tranquilly, and deeply, and with a warm color in his cheeks, I said, rearranging the coverlet, and retiring to my wife, who sat almost breathless whilst I was looking at our little boy. Thank God," she said quietly, and she wept again, and rising, came to his bedside. Yes, alive, thank God, but it seems to me he is breathing very short, and with difficulty, and does he not look hot and feverish?" "Yes, he is very hot. Feel his little hand, feel his neck, merciful heaven. He is burning." It was, indeed, very true, that his skin was unnaturally dry and hot. His little pulse, too, was going at a fearful rate. "I do think," said I, resolved to conceal the extent of my own apprehensions, "I do think that he is just a little feverish, but he has often been much more so, and will, I dare say, in the morning, be perfectly well again. I dare say, but for little Fanny's dream, we should not have observed it at all." "Oh, my darling, my darling, my darling," sobbed the poor little woman, leaning over the bed, with her hands locked together, and looking the very picture of despair. "Oh, my darling, what has happened to you? I put you into your bed, looking so well and beautiful, this evening, and here you are, stricken with sickness, my own little love. Oh, you will not, you cannot, leave your poor mother." It was quite plain that she despaired of the child from the moment we had ascertained that it was unwell. As it happened, her presentiment was but too truly prophetic. The apothecary said the child's ailment was suppressed smallpox, the physician pronounced it typhus. The only certainty about it was the issue: the child died. To me few things appear so beautiful as a very young child in its shroud. The little innocent face looks so sublimely simple and confiding amongst the cold terrors of death, crimeless and fearless. That little mortal has passed alone under the shadow, and explored the mystery of dissolution. There is death in its sublimest and purest image. No hatred, no hypocrisy, no suspicion, no care for the morrow ever darkened that little face. Death has come lovingly upon it. There is nothing cruel or harsh in his victory. The yearnings of love, indeed, cannot be stifled, for the prattle and smiles, and all the little world of thoughts that were so delightful, are gone forever. Or, too, will overcast us in its presence, for we are looking on death, but we do not fear for the little, lonely voyager, for the child has gone, simple and trusting, into the presence of its all-wise Father, and of such, we know, is the kingdom of heaven. And so we parted from poor little baby. I and his poor old nurse drove in a mourning carriage, in which lay the little coffin, early in the morning, to the churchyard of. Sore, indeed, was my heart, as I followed that little coffin to the grave. Another burial had just concluded as we entered the churchyard, and the mourners stood in clusters round the grave, into which the sexton was now shoveling the mould. As I stood, with head uncovered, listening to the sublime and touching service which our ritual prescribes, I found that a gentleman had drawn near also, and was standing at my elbow. I did not turn to look at him until the earth had closed over my darling boy. I then walked a little way apart, that I might be alone, and drying my eyes, sat down upon a tombstone, to let the confusion of my mind subside. While I was thus lost in a sorrowful reverie, the gentleman who had stood near me at the grave was once more at my side. The face of the stranger, though I could not call it handsome, was very remarkable. Its expression was the purest and noblest I could conceive, and it was made very beautiful by a look of such compassion as I never saw before. "Why do you sorrow as one without hope?" he said, gently. "I have no hope," I answered. "Nay, I think you have," he answered again, "and I am sure you will soon have more. That little child for which you grieve, has escaped the dangers and miseries of life. Its body has perished, but he will receive in the end the crown of life. God has given him an early victory. I know not what it was in him that rebuked my sullen pride, and humbled and saddened me, as I listened to this man. He was dressed in deep mourning, and looked more serene, noble, and sweet than any I had ever seen. He was young, too, as I have said, and his voice very clear and harmonious. He talked to me for a long time, and I listened to him with involuntary reverence. At last, however, he left me, saying he had often seen me walking into town, about the same hour that he used to go that way, and that if he saw me again he would walk with me, and so we might reason of these things together. It was late when I returned to my home, now a house of mourning. Part 2. Our home was one of sorrow and of fear. The child's death had stricken us with terror no less than grief. Referring it, as we both tacitly did, to the mysterious and fiendish agency of the abhorred being whom, in an evil hour, we had admitted into our house, we both viewed him with a degree and species of fear for which I can find no name. I felt that some further calamity was impending. I could not hope that we were to be delivered from the presence of the malignant agent who haunted, rather than inhabited our home, without some additional proofs alike of his malice and his power. My poor wife's presentiments were still more terrible and overpowering, though not more defined, than my own. She was never tranquil while our little girl was out of her sight, always dreading and expecting some new revelation of the evil influence which, as we were indeed both persuaded, has bereft our darling little boy of life. Against an hostility so unearthly and intangible there was no guarding, and the sense of helplessness intensified the misery of our situation. Tormented with doubts of the very basis of her religion, and recoiling from the ordeal of prayer with the strange horror with which the victim of hydrophobia repels the pure water, she no longer found the consolation which, had sorrow reached her in any other shape, she would have drawn from the healing influence of religion. We were both of us unhappy, dismayed, demon-stricken. Meanwhile, our lodger's habits continued precisely the same. If, indeed, the sounds which came from his apartments were to be trusted, he and his agents were more on the alert than ever. I can convey to you, good reader, no notion, even the faintest, of the dreadful sensation always more or less present to my mind, and sometimes with a reality which thrilled me almost to frenzy the apprehension that I had admitted into my house the incarnate spirit of the dead or damned, to torment me and my family. It was some nights after the burial of our dear little baby. We had not gone to bed until late, and I had slept, I suppose, some hours, when I was awakened by my wife, who clung to me with the energy of terror. She said nothing, but grasped and shook me with more than her natural strength. She had crept close to me, and was cowering with her head under the bedclothes. The room was perfectly dark, as usual, for we burned no nightlight, but from the side of the bed next her proceeded a voice as of one sitting there with his head within a foot of the curtains, and, merciful heavens! It was the voice of our lodger. He was discoursing of the death of our baby, and inveighing, in the old mocking tone of hate and suppressed fury, against the justice, mercy, and goodness of God. He did this with a terrible plausibility of sophistry, and with a resolute emphasis and precision, which seemed to imply, I have got something to tell you, and, whether you like it or like it not, I will say out my say. To pretend that I felt anger at his intrusion, or emotion of any sort, save the one sense of palsied terror, would be to depart from the truth. I lay, cold and breathless, as if frozen to death, unable to move, unable to utter a cry with the voice of that demon pouring, in the dark, his undisguised blasphemies and temptations close into my ears. At last the dreadful voice ceased. Whether the speaker went or stayed I could not tell. The silence, which he might be improving for the purpose of some hellish stratagem, was to me more tremendous even than his speech. We both lay awake, not daring to move or speak, scarcely even breathing, but clasping one another fast, until at length the welcome light of day streamed into the room through the opening door, as the servant came in to call us. I need not say that our nocturnal visitant had left us. The magnanimous reader will, perhaps, pronounce that I ought to have pulled on my boots and inexpressibles with all available dispatch, run to my lodger's bedroom, and kicked him forthwith downstairs, and the entire way moreover out to the public road, as some compensation for the scandalous affront put upon me and my wife by his impertinent visit. Now, at that time, I had no scruples against what are termed the laws of honor, was by no means deficient in pluck, and gifted, moreover, with a somewhat excitable temper. Yet, I will honestly avow that, so far from courting a collision with the dreaded stranger, I would have recoiled at his very sight, and given my eyes to avoid him. Such was the ascendancy which he had acquired over me, as well as everybody else in my household, in his own quiet, irresistible, hellish way. The shuddering antipathy which our guest inspired did not rob his infernal homily of its effect. It was not a new or strange thing which he presented to our minds. There was an awful subtlety in the train of his suggestions. All that he had said had floated through my own mind before, without order, indeed, or show of logic. From my own rebellious heart the same evil thoughts had risen, like pale apparitions hovering and lost in the fumes of a necromancer's cauldron. His was like the summing up of all this, a reflection of my own feelings and fancies, but reduced to an awful order and definiteness, and clothed with a sophistical form of argument. The effect of it was powerful. It revived and exaggerated these bad emotions, it methodized and justified them, and gave to impulses and impressions, vague and desultory before, something of the compactness of a system. My misfortune, therefore, did not soften, it exasperated me. I regarded the great disposer of events as a persecutor of the human race, who took delight in their miseries. I asked why my innocent child had been smitten down into the grave ? And why my darling wife, whose first object, I knew, had ever been to serve and glorify her Maker, should have been thus tortured and desolated by the cruelest calamity which the malignity of a demon could have devised. I railed and blasphemed, and even in my agony defied God with the impotent rage and desperation of a devil, in his everlasting torment. In my bitterness, I could not forbear speaking these impenitent repetitions of the language of our nightly visitant, even in the presence of my wife. She heard me with agony, almost with terror. I pitied and loved her too much not to respect even her weaknesses, for so I characterized her humble submission to the chastisements of heaven. But even while I spared her reverential sensitiveness, the spectacle of her patience but enhanced my own gloomy and impenitent rage. I was walking into town in this evil mood, when I was overtaken by the gentleman whom I had spoken with in the churchyard on the morning when my little boy was buried. I called him gentleman, but I could not say what was his rank. I never thought about it. There was a grace, a purity, a compassion, and a grandeur of intellect in his countenance, in his language, in his mien, that was beautiful and king-like. I felt, in his company, a delightful awe, and an humbleness more gratifying than any elation of earthly pride. He divined my state of feeling, but he said nothing harsh. He did not rebuke, but he reasoned with me, and oh, how mighty was that reasoning, without formality, without effort, as the flower grows and blossoms. Its process was in harmony with the successions of nature, gentle, spontaneous, irresistible. At last he left me. I was grieved at his departure. I was wonder-stricken. His discourse had made me cry tears at once sweet and bitter. It had sounded depths I knew not of, and my heart was disquieted within me. Yet my trouble was happier than the resentful and defiant calm that had reigned within me before. When I came home, I told my wife of my having met the same good, wise man I had first seen by the grave of my child. I recounted to her his discourse, and, as I brought it again to mind, my tears flowed afresh, and I was happy while I wept. I now see that the calamity which bore at first such evil fruit, was good for me. It fixed my mind, however rebelliously, upon God, and it stirred up all the passions of my heart. Levity, inattention, and self-complacency are obstacles harder to be overcome than the violence of evil passions. The transition from hate is easier than from indifference to love. A mighty change was making on my mind. I need not particularize the occasions upon which I again met my friend, for so I knew him to be, nor detail the train of reasoning and feeling which in such interviews he followed out. It is enough to say, that he assiduously cultivated the good seed he had sown, and that his benignant teachings took deep root, and flourished in my soul, heretofore so barren. One evening, having enjoyed on the morning of the same day another of those delightful and convincing conversations, I was returning on foot homeward, and as darkness had nearly closed, and the night threatened cold and fog, the footpaths were nearly deserted. As I walked on, deeply absorbed in the discourse I had heard on the same morning, a person overtook me, and continued to walk, without much increasing the interval between us, a little in advance of me. There came upon me, at the same moment, an indefinable sinking of the heart, a strange and unaccountable fear. The pleasing topics of my meditations melted away, and gave place to a sense of danger, all the more unpleasant that it was vague and objectless. I looked up. What was that which moved before me? I stared, I faltered, my heart fluttered as if it would choke me, and then stood still. It was the peculiar and unmistakable form of our lodger. Exactly as I looked at him, he turned his head, and looked at me over his shoulder. His face was muffled as usual. I cannot have seen its features with any completeness, yet I felt that his look was one of fury. The next instant he was at my side, and my heart quailed within me. My limbs all but refused their office, yet the very emotions of terror, which might have overcome me, acted as a stimulus, and I quickened my pace. Hey! What a pious person! So I suppose you have learned at last that evil communications corrupt good manners, and you are absolutely afraid of the old infidel, the old blasphemer, hey? I made him no answer. I was indeed too much agitated to speak. You'll make a good Christian, no doubt, he continued. The independent man, who thinks for himself, reasons his way to his principles, and sticks fast to them, is sure to be true to whatever system he embraces. You have been so consistent a philosopher, that I am sure you will make a steady Christian. You're not the man to be led by the nose by a sophistical mumbler. You could never be made the prey of a grasping proselytism. You are not the sport of every whiff of doctrine, nor the facile slave of whatever superstition is last buzzed in your ear. No, Number, you've got a masculine intellect, and think for yourself, hey? I was incapable of answering him. I quickened my pace to escape from his detested persecution, but he was close beside me still. We walked on together thus for a time, during which I heard him muttering fast to himself, like a man under fierce and malignant excitement. We reached, at length, the gateway of my dwelling, and I turned the latchkey in the wicket, and entered the enclosure. As we stood together within, he turned full upon me, and confronting me with an aspect whose character I felt rather than saw, he said, "And so you mean to be a Christian, after all? Now just reflect how very absurdly you are choosing. Leave the Bible to that class of fanatics who may hope to be saved under its system, and, in the name of common sense, study the Quran, or some less ascetic tome. Don't be gulled by a plausible slave, who wants nothing more than to multiply professors of his theory. Why don't you read the Bible, you miserable, puling poltroon, before you hug it as a treasure? Why don't you read it, and learn out of the mouth of the founder of Christianity, that there is one sin for which there is no forgiveness, blasphemy against the Holy Ghost, hey ? And that sin I myself have heard you commit by the hour in my presence in my room. I have heard you commit it in our free discussions a dozen times. The Bible seals against you the lips of mercy. If it be true, you are this moment as irrevocably damned as if you had died with those blasphemies on your lips." Having thus spoken, he glided into the house. I followed slowly. His words rang in my ears. I was stunned. What he had said I feared might be true. Giant despair felled me to the earth. He had recalled, and lighted up with the glare from the pit, remembrances with which I knew not how to cope. It was true, I had spoken with daring impiety of subjects whose sacredness I now began to appreciate. With trembling hands I opened the Bible. I read and reread the mysterious doom recorded by the Redeemer himself against blasphemers of the Holy Ghost, monsters set apart from the human race, and damned and dead, even while they live and walk upon the earth. I groaned, I wept. Henceforward the Bible, I thought, must be to me a dreadful record of despair. I dared not read it. I will not weary you with all my mental agonies. My dear little wife did something toward relieving my mind, but it was reserved for the friend, to whose heavenly society I owed so much, to tranquilize it once more. He talked this time to me longer, and even more earnestly than before. I soon encountered him again. He expounded to me the ways of providence, and showed me how needful sorrow was for every servant of God. How mercy was disguised in tribulation, and our best happiness came to us, like our children, in tears and wailing. He showed me that trials were sent to call us up, with a voice of preternatural power, from the mortal apathy of sin and the world. And then, again, in our new and better state, to prove our patience and our faith. The more trouble befalls you, the nearer is God to you. He visits you in sorrow, and sorrow, as well as joy, is a sign of his presence. If, then, other griefs overtake you, remember this, be patient, be faithful, and bless the name of God. I returned home comforted and happy, although I felt assured that some further and sadder trial was before me. Still our household was overcast by the same insurmountable dread of our tenant. The same strange habits characterized him, and the same unaccountable sounds disquieted us. An atmosphere of death and malice hovered about his door, and we all hated and feared to pass it. Let me now tell, as well and briefly as I may, the dreadful circumstances of my last great trial. One morning, my wife being about her household affairs, and I on the point of starting for town, I went into the parlor for some letters which I was to take with me. I cannot easily describe my consternation when, on entering the room, I saw our lodger seated near the windows, with our darling little girl upon his knee. His back was toward the door, but I could plainly perceive that the respirator had been removed from his mouth, and that the odious green goggles were raised. He was sitting, as it seemed, absolutely without motion, and his face was advanced close to that of the child. I stood looking at this group in a state of stupor for some seconds. He was, I suppose, conscious of my presence, for although he did not turn his head, or otherwise take any note of my arrival, he readjusted the muffler which usually covered his mouth, and lowered the clumsy spectacles to their proper place. The child was sitting upon his knee as motionless as he himself, with a countenance white and rigid as that of a corpse, and from which every trace of meaning, except some vague character of terror, had fled. and staring with a fixed and dilated gaze into his face. As it seemed, she did not perceive my presence. Her eyes were transfixed and fascinated. She did not even seem to me to breathe. Horror and anguish at last overcame my stupefaction. What is it?" I cried. "What ails my child, my darling child? I'd be glad to know, myself," he replied, coolly. "It is certainly something very queer. What is it, darling?" I repeated, frantically, addressing the child. "What is it?" he reiterated. "Why, it's pretty plain, I should suppose, that the child is ill. Oh merciful God!" I cried, half furious, half terrified. "You have injured her, you have terrified her. Give me my child, give her to me." These words I absolutely shouted, and stamped upon the floor in my horrid excitement. "Pooh, pooh," he said, with a sort of ugly sneer. "The child is nervous, you'll make her more so. Be quiet and she'll probably find her tongue presently." I have had her on my knee some minutes, but the sweet bird could not tell what ails her. "Let the child go," I shouted in a voice of thunder. "Let her go, I say, let her go." He took the passive, death-like child, and placed her standing by the window, and rising, he simply said, "As soon as you grow cool, you are welcome to ask me what questions you like. The child is plainly ill. I should not wonder if she had seen something that frightened her." Having thus spoken, he passed from the room. I felt as if I spoke, saw, and walked in a horrid dream. I seized the darling child in my arms, and bore her away to her mother. "What is it, for mercy's sake? What is the matter?" she cried, growing in an instant as pale as the poor child herself. I found that demon in the parlor with a child on his lap, staring in her face. "She is manifestly terrified. Oh, gracious God! She is lost, she is killed," cried the poor mother, frantically looking into the white, apathetic, meaningless face of the child. "Fanny, darling Fanny, tell us if you are ill," I cried, pressing the little girl in terror to my heart. "Tell your own mother, my darling," echoed my poor little wife. "Oh, darling, darling child, speak to your poor mother." It was all in vain. Still the same dilated, imploring gaze, the same pale face, wild and dumb. We brought her to the open window, we gave her cold water to drink, we sprinkled it in her face. We sent for the apothecary, who lived hard by, and he arrived in a few moments, with a parcel of tranquilizing medicines. These, however, were equally unavailing. Hour after hour passed away. The darling child looked upon us as if she would have given the world to speak to us, or to weep, but she uttered no sound. Now and then she drew a long breath as though preparing to say something, but still she was mute. She often put her hand to her throat, as if there was some pain or obstruction there. I never can, while I live, lose one line of that mournful and terrible portrait, the face of my stricken child. As hour after hour passed away, without bringing the smallest change or amendment, we grew both alarmed, and at length absolutely terrified for her safety. We called in a physician toward night, and told him that we had reason to suspect that the child had somehow been frightened, and that in no other way could we at all account for the extraordinary condition in which he found her. This was a man, I may as well observe, though I do not name him, of the highest eminence in his profession, and one in whose skill, from past personal experience, I had the best possible reasons for implicitly confiding. He asked a multiplicity of questions, the answers to which seemed to baffle his attempts to arrive at a satisfactory diagnosis. There was something undoubtedly anomalous in the case, and I saw plainly that there were features in it which puzzled and perplexed him not a little. At length, however, he wrote his prescription, and promised to return at 9 o'clock. I remember there was something to be rubbed along her spine, and some medicines beside, but these remedies were as entirely unavailing as the others. In a state of dismay and distraction we watched by the bed in which, in accordance with the physician's direction, we had placed her. The absolute changelessness of her condition filled us with despair. The day which had elapsed had not witnessed even a transitory variation in the dreadful character of her seizure. Any change, even a change for the worse, would have been better than this sluggish, hopeless monotony of suffering. At the appointed hour the physician returned. He appeared disappointed, almost shocked, at the failure of his prescriptions. On feeling her pulse he declared that she must have a little wine. There had been a wonderful prostration of all the vital powers since he had seen her before. He evidently thought the case a strange and precarious one. She was made to swallow the wine, and her pulse rallied for a time, but soon subsided again. I and the physician were standing by the fire, talking in whispers of the darling child's symptoms, and likelihood of recovery, when we were arrested in our conversation by a cry of anguish from the poor mother, who had never left the bedside of her little child, and this cry broke into bitter and convulsive weeping. The poor little child had, on a sudden, stretched down her little hands and feet, and died. There is no mistaking the features of death. The filmy eye and drop jaw once seen, are recognized whenever we meet them again. Yet, spite of our belief, we cling to hope, and the distracted mother called on the physician, in accents which might have moved a statue, to say that her darling was not dead, not quite dead, that something might still be done, that it could not be all over. Silently he satisfied himself that no throb of life still fluttered in that little frame. "It is, indeed, all over," he said, in tones scarce above a whisper, and pressing my hand kindly, he said, "Comfort your poor wife," and so, after a momentary pause, he left the room. This blow had smitten me with stunning suddenness. I looked at the dead child, and from her to her poor mother. Grief and pity were both swallowed up in transports of fury and detestation with which the presence in my house of the wretch who had wrought all this destruction and misery filled my soul. My heart swelled with ungovernable rage. For a moment my habitual fear of him was neutralized by the vehemence of these passions. I seized a candle in silence, and mounted the stairs. The sight of the accursed cat, flitting across the lobby, and the loneliness of the hour, made me hesitate for an instant. I had, however, gone so far, that shame sustained me. Overcoming a momentary thrill of dismay, and determined to repel and defy the influence that had so long awed me, I knocked sharply at the door, and, almost at the same instant, pushed it open, and entered our lodger's chamber. He had had no candle in the room, and it was lighted only by the darkness visible that entered through the window. The candle which I held very imperfectly illuminated the large apartment, but I saw his spectral form floating, rather than walking, back and forward in front of the windows. At sight of him, though I hated him more than ever, my instinctive fear returned. He confronted me, and drew nearer and nearer, without speaking. There was something indefinably fearful in the silent attraction which seemed to be drawing him to me. I could not help recoiling, little by little, as he came toward me, and with an effort I said, "You know why I have come, the child, she's dead, dead ha exclamation mark, dead is she?" He said, in his odious, mocking tone, "Yes, dead." I cried, with an excitement which chilled my very marrow with horror, "And you have killed her, as you killed my other, how question mark I killed her exclamation mark a question mark ha, ha." He said, still edging nearer and nearer, "Yes, I say you." I shouted, trembling in every joint, but possessed by that unaccountable infatuation which has made men invoke, spite of themselves, their own destruction, and which I was powerless to resist. "Deny it as you may, it is you who killed her wretch exclamation mark fiend exclamation mark no wonder she could not stand the breath and glare of hell. And you are one of those who believe that not a sparrow falls to the ground without your Creator's consent," he said, with icy sarcasm, "and this is a specimen of Christian resignation, hey? You charge his act upon a poor fellow like me, simply that you may cheat the devil, and rave and rebel against the decrees of heaven, under pretense of abusing me. The breath and flare of hell exclamation mark eh? You mean that I removed this and these, touching the covering of his mouth and eyes successively, as I shall do now again, and show you there's no great harm in that." There was a tone of menace in his concluding words not to be mistaken. "Murderer and liar from the beginning, as you are, I defy you," I shouted, in a frenzy of hate and horror, stamping furiously on the floor. As I said this, it seemed to me that he darkened and dilated before my eyes. My senses, thoughts, consciousness, grew horribly confused, as if some powerful, extraneous will, was seizing upon the functions of my brain. Whether I were to be mastered by death, or madness, or possession, I knew not, but hideous destruction of some sort was impending. All hung upon the moment, and I cried aloud, in my agony, an adjuration in the name of the three persons of the Trinity, that he should not torment me. Stunned, bewildered, like a man recovered from a drunken fall, I stood, freezing and breathless, in the same spot, looking into the room, which wore, in my eyes, a strange, unearthly character. Mr. Smith was cowering darkly in the window, and, after a silence, spoke to me in a croaking, sulky tone, which was, however, unusually submissive. "Don't it strike you as an odd procedure to break into a gentleman's apartment at such an hour, for the purpose of railing at him in the coarsest language? If you have any charge to make against me, do so. I invite inquiry and defy your worst. If you think you can bring home to me the smallest share of blame in this unlucky matter, call the coroner, and let his inquest examine and cross-examine me, and sift the matter if, indeed, there is anything to be sifted to the bottom. Meanwhile, go you about your business, and leave me to mine. But I see how the wind sits. You want to get rid of me, and so you make the place odious to me. But it won't do, and if you take to making criminal charges against me, You had better look to yourself, for two can play at that game. There was a suppressed whine in all this, which strangely contrasted with the cool and threatening tone of his previous conversation. Without answering a word I hurried from the room, and scarcely felt secure, even when once more in the melancholy chamber, where my poor wife was weeping. Miserable, horrible was the night that followed. The loss of our child was a calamity which we had not dared to think of. It had come, and with a suddenness enough to bereave me of reason. It seemed all unreal, all fantastic. It needed an effort to convince me, minute after minute, that the dreadful truth was so, and the old accustomed feeling that she was still alive, still running from room to room, and the expectation that I should hear her step and her voice, and see her entering at the door, would return. But still the sense of dismay, of having received some stunning, irreparable blow, remained behind, and then came the horrible effort, like that with which one rouses himself from a haunted sleep, the question, what disaster is this that has befallen? Answered, alas! But too easily, too terribly. Amidst all this was perpetually rising before my fancy the obscure, dilated figure of our lodger, as he had confronted me in his malign power that night. I dismissed the image with a shudder as often as it recurred, and even now, at this distance of time, I have felt more than I could well describe in a mere effort to fix my recollection upon its hated traits. While writing the passages I have just concluded, this hateful scene I did not recount to my poor wife. Its horrors were too fresh upon me. I had not courage to trust myself with the agitating narrative, and so I sat beside her, with her hand locked in mine. I had no comfort to offer but the dear love I bore her. At last, like a child, she cried herself to sleep the dull, heavy slumber of worn-out grief. As for me, the agitation of my soul was too fearful and profound for repose. My eye accidentally rested on the holy volume, which lay upon the table open, as I had left it in the morning, and the first words which met my eye were these: "For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory." This blessed sentence riveted my attention, and shed a stream of solemn joy upon my heart, and so the greater part of that mournful night, I continued to draw comfort and heavenly wisdom from the same inspired source. Next day brought the odious incident, the visit of the undertaker, the carpentry, upholstery, and millinery of death. Why has not civilization abolished these repulsive and shocking formalities? What has the poor corpse to do with frills, and pillows, and napkins, and all the equipage in which it rides on its last journey? There is no intrusion so jarring to the decent grief of surviving affection, no conceivable mummery more derisive of mortality. In the room which we had been so long used to call the nursery, now desolate and mute, the unclosed coffin lay, with our darling shrouded in it. Before we went to our rest at night we visited it. In the morning the lid was to close over that sweet face, and I was to see the child laid by her little brother. We looked upon the well-known and loved features, purified in the sublime serenity of death, for a long time, whispering to one another, among our sobs, how sweet and beautiful we thought she looked, and at length, weeping bitterly, we tore ourselves away. We talked and wept for many hours, and at last, in sheer exhaustion, dropped asleep. My little wife awaked me, and said, "I think they have come, the undertakers." It was still dark, so I could not consult my watch, but they were to have arrived early, and as it was winter, and the nights long, the hour of their visit might well have arrived. "What, darling, is your reason for thinking so?" I asked. "I am sure I have heard them for some time in the nursery," she answered. "Oh, dear, dear little Fanny. Don't allow them to close the coffin until I have seen my darling once more." I got up, and threw some clothes hastily about me. I opened the door and listened. A sound like a muffled knocking reached me from the nursery. "Yes, my darling," I said, "I think they have come. I will go and desire them to wait until you have seen her again." And, so saying, I hastened from the room. Our bedchamber lay at the end of a short corridor, opening from the lobby, at the head of the stairs, and the nursery was situated nearly at the end of a corresponding passage, which opened from the same lobby at the opposite side. As I hurried along I distinctly heard the same sounds. The light of dawn had not yet appeared, but there was a strong moonlight shining through the windows. I thought the morning could hardly be so far advanced as we had at first supposed, but still, strangely as it now seems to me, suspecting nothing amiss, I walked on in noiseless, slippered feet, to the nursery door. It stood half open. Someone had unquestionably visited it since we had been there. I stepped forward, and entered. At the threshold horror arrested my advance. The coffin was placed upon trestles at the further extremity of the chamber, with the foot of it nearly towards the door, and a large window at the side of it admitted the cold lustre of the moon full upon the apparatus of mortality. and the objects immediately about it. At the foot of the coffin stood the ungainly form of our lodger. He seemed to be intently watching the face of the corpse, and was stooped a little, while with his hands he tapped sharply, from time to time at the sides of the coffin, like one who designs to awaken a slumberer. Perched upon the body of the child, and nuzzling among the grave clothes, with a strange kind of ecstasy, was the detested brute, the cat I have so often mentioned. The group thus revealed, I looked upon but for one instant. In the next I shouted, in absolute terror, "In God's name! What are you doing?" Our lodger shuffled away abruptly, as if disconcerted, but the ill-favored cat, whisking round, stood like a demon sentinel upon the corpse, growling and hissing, with arched back and glaring eyes. The lodger, turning abruptly toward me, motioned me to one side. Mechanically I obeyed his gesture, and he hurried hastily from the room. Sick and dizzy, I returned to my own chamber. I confess I had not nerve to combat the infernal brute, which still held possession of the room, and so I left it undisturbed. This incident I did not tell to my wife until some time afterwards, and I mention it here because it was, and is, in my mind associated with a painful circumstance which very soon afterwards came to light. That morning I witnessed the burial of my darling child. Sore and desolate was my heart, but with infinite gratitude to the great controller of all events, I recognized in it a change which nothing but the Spirit of all good can effect. The love and fear of God had grown strong within me. In humbleness I bowed to his awful will. With a sincere trust I relied upon the goodness, the wisdom, and the mercy of him who had sent this great affliction. But a further incident connected with this very calamity was to test this trust and patience to the uttermost. It was still early when I returned, having completed the last sad office. My wife, as I afterwards learned, still lay weeping upon her bed. But somebody awaited my return in the hall, and opened the door, anticipating my knock. This person was our lodger. I was too much appalled by the sudden presentation of this abhorred spectre even to retreat, as my instinct could have directed, through the open door. "I have been expecting your return," he said, with the design of saying something which it might have profited you to learn, "but now I apprehend it is too late. What a pity you are so violent and impatient. You would not have heard me, in all probability, this morning. You cannot think how cross-grained and intemperate you have grown since you became a saint, but that is your affair, not mine. You have buried your little daughter this morning. It requires a good deal of that new attribute of yours, faith, which judges all things by a rule of contraries, and can never see anything but kindness in the worst afflictions which malignity could devise, to discover benignity and mercy in the torturing calamity which has just punished you and your wife for nothing. But I fancy that it will be harder still when I tell you what I more than suspect. Ha! Ha! It would be really ridiculous, if it were not heartrending, that your little girl has been actually buried alive. Do you comprehend me? Alive. For, upon my life, I fancy she was not dead as she lay in her coffin. I knew the wretch was exulting in the fresh anguish he had just inflicted. I know not how it was, but any announcement of disaster from his lips seemed to me to be necessarily true. Half stifled with the dreadful emotions he had raised, palpitating between hope and terror, I rushed frantically back again, the way I had just come, running as fast as my speed could carry me, toward the, alas, distant burial ground where my darling lay. I stopped a cab slowly returning to town, at the corner of the lane, sprang into it, directed the man to drive to the church of, and promised him anything and everything for dispatch. The man seemed amazed, doubtful, perhaps, whether he carried a maniac or a malefactor. Still he took his chance for the promised reward, and galloped his horse, while I, tortured with suspense, yelled my frantic incentives to further speed. At last, in a space immeasurably short, but which to me was protracted almost beyond endurance, we reached the spot. I hallooed to the sexton, who was now employed upon another grave, to follow me. I myself seized a mattock, and in obedience to my incoherent and agonized commands, he worked as he had never worked before. The crumbling mold flew swiftly to the upper soil. Deeper and deeper, every moment, grew the narrow grave. At last I sobbed, thank God, as I saw the face of the coffin emerge. A few seconds more and it lay upon the sward beside me, and we both, with the edges of our spades, ripped up the lid. There was the corpse, but not the tranquil statue I had seen at last. Its knees were both raised, and one of its little hands drawn up and clenched near its throat, as if in a feeble but agonized struggle to force up the superincumbent mass. The eyes, that I had last seen closed, were now open, and the face no longer serenely pale, but livid and distorted. I had time to see all in an instant. The whole scene reeled and darkened before me, and I swooned away. When I came to myself, I found that I had been removed to the vestry room. The open coffin was in the aisle of the church, surrounded by a curious crowd. A medical gentleman had examined the body carefully, and had pronounced life totally extinct. The trepidation and horror I experienced were indescribable. I felt like the murderer of my own child. Desperate as I was of any chance of its life, I dispatched messengers for no less than 3 of the most eminent physicians then practicing in London. All concurred the child was now as dead as any other, the oldest tenant of the churchyard, notwithstanding which, I would not permit the body to be reinterred for several days, until the symptoms of decay became unequivocal, and the most fantastic imagination could no longer cherish a doubt. This, however, I mention only parenthetically, as I hasten to the conclusion of my narrative. The circumstance which I have last described found its way to the public, and caused no small sensation at the time. I drove part of the way home, and then discharged the cab, and walked the remainder. On my way, with an emotion of ecstasy I cannot describe, I met the good being to whom I owed so much. I ran to meet him, and felt as if I could throw myself at his feet, and kiss the very ground before him. I knew by his heavenly countenance he was come to speak comfort and healing to my heart. With humbleness and gratitude, I drank in his sage and holy discourse. I need not follow the gracious and delightful exposition of God's revealed will and character with which he cheered and confirmed my faltering spirit. A solemn joy, a peace and trust, streamed on my heart. The wreck and desolation there, lost their bleak and ghastly character, like ruins illuminated by the mellow beams of a solemn summer sunset. In this conversation, I told him what I had never revealed to anyone before, the absolute terror, in all its stupendous and maddening amplitude, with which I regarded our ill-omened lodger, and my agonized anxiety to rid my house of him. My companion answered me, "I know the person of whom you speak. He designs no good for you or any other. He, too, knows me, and I have intimated to him that he must now leave you, and visit you no more. Be firm and bold, trusting in God, through his Son, like a good soldier, and you will win the victory from a greater and even worse than heathen unseen enemy of mankind. You need not see or speak with your evil tenant any more. Call to him from your hall, in the name of the Most Holy, to leave you bodily, with all that appertains to him, this evening. He knows that he must go, and will obey you. But leave the house as soon as may be yourself, you will scarce have peace in it. Your own remembrances will trouble you, and other minds have established associations within its walls and chambers too." These words sounded mysteriously in my ears. Let me say here, before I bring my reminiscences to a close, a word or two about the house in which these detested scenes occurred, and which I did not long continue to inhabit. What I afterwards learned of it, seemed to supply in part a dim explanation of these words. In a country village there is no difficulty in accounting for the tenacity with which the sinister character of a haunted tenement cleaves to it. Thin neighborhoods are favorable to scandal, and in such localities the reputation of a house, like that of a woman, once blown upon, never quite recovers. In huge London, however, it is quite another matter, and, therefore, it was with some surprise that, 5 years after I had vacated the house in which the occurrences I have described took place, I learned that a respectable family who had taken it were obliged to give it up, on account of annoyances, for which they could not account, and all proceeding from the apartments formerly occupied by our lodger. Among the sounds described were footsteps restlessly traversing the floor of that room, accompanied by the peculiar tapping of the crutch. I was so anxious about this occurrence, that I contrived to have strict inquiries made into the matter. The result, however, added little to what I had at first learned, except, indeed, that our old friend, the cat, bore a part in the transaction, as I suspected, for the servant, who had been placed to sleep in the room, complained that something bounded on and off, and ran to and fro along the foot of the bed, in the dark. The same servant, while in the room, in the broad daylight, had heard the sound of walking, and even the rustling of clothes near him, as of people passing and repassing, and, although he had never seen anything, he yet became so terrified that he would not remain in the house, and ultimately, in a short time, left his situation. These sounds, attention having been called to them, were now incessantly observed: the measured walking up and down the room, the opening and closing of the door, and the teasing tap of the crutch. All these sounds were continually repeated, until at last, worn out, frightened, and worried, its occupants resolved on abandoning the house. About 4 years since, having had occasion to visit the capital, I resolved on a ramble by Old Brompton, just to see if the house was still inhabited. I searched for it, however, in vain, and at length, with difficulty, ascertained its site, upon which now stood 2 small, staring, brand-new brick houses, with each a gay enclosure of flowers. Every trace of our old mansion, and, let us hope, of our mysterious lodger, had entirely vanished. Let me, However, return to my narrative where I left it. Discoursing upon heavenly matters, my good and gracious friend accompanied me even within the outer gate of my own house. I asked him to come in and rest himself, but he would not, and before he turned to depart, he lifted up his hand, and blessed me and my household. Having done this, he went away. My eyes followed him till he disappeared, and I turned to the house. My darling wife was standing at the window of the parlor. There was a seraphic smile on her face, pale, pure, and beautiful as death. She was gazing with an humble, heavenly earnestness on us. The parting blessing of the stranger shed a sweet and hallowed influence on my heart. I went into the parlor. To my darling, childless she was now, I had now need to be a tender companion to her. She raised her arms in a sort of transport, with the same smile of gratitude and purity, and, throwing them round my neck, she said, "I have seen him. It is he, the man that came with you to the door, and blessed us as he went away, is the same I saw in my dream, the same who took little baby in his arms, and said he would take care of him, and give him safely to me again. More than a quarter of a century has glided away since then. Other children have been given us by the good God, children who have been, from infancy to maturity, a pride and blessing to us. Sorrows and reverses, too, have occasionally visited us, yet, on the whole, we have been greatly blessed. Prosperity has long since ended all the cares of the res angusta domi, and expanded our power of doing good to our fellow creatures. God has given it, and God, we trust, directs its dispensation in our children, and would you think it ? Our grandchildren, too. The same beneficent God has given us objects that elicit and return all the delightful affections, and exchange the sweet converse that makes home and family dearer than aught else, save that blessed home where the Christian family shall meet at last. The dear companion of my early love and sorrows still lives, blessed be heaven. The evening tints of life have fallen upon her, but the dear remembrance of a first love, that never grew cold, makes her beauty changeless for me. As for your humble servant, he is considerably her senior, and looks it. Time has stolen away his raven locks, and given him a shower of snow instead. But, as I said before, I and my wife love, and, I believe, admire one another more than ever, and I have often seen our elder children smile archly at one another, when they thought we did not observe them, thinking, no doubt, how like a pair of lovers we two were,